Josh Phelps of Grounded Wine Company. Dude, I'm going to tell you, man, it's an honor to have you here today on the Mr. Wine Guy podcast, brother.
Honor to be here. Thanks for having me, man.
I've told you this. I've actually told other people too, but there's a few reasons why I'm excited to have you here. For one, I think you're a super cool dude. If I'm in Napa Valley or if I'm moving to do some work in Napa, I'm looking you up. I'm hitting you up. I want to be a part of your camp, dude. You're an awesome guy. You're just one of those guys that's out there bringing so many people together, and we're in the same age group. And so I really appreciate you just from a personal standpoint. I think you're an awesome guy. Um, One of the things that I think is very inspiring about you is you've managed to be so good at one of the hardest things in wine, and that's actually selling wine. And a lot of people say that winemaking is such a challenge, the people that are in the industry. But I was interviewing Dan Petrosky, and he said, it's funny because people like him or people like you, he said, it may seem like we're in the business to make wine, but we're actually in the business to sell wine. And you have a
No,
lot of experience with that, dude. And I think that like you went and you crushed that part of what you do head on right from the get go. And I think that's really cool. And also, dude, one thing I want to say for the listeners that I think is really cool is the fact that you and your father worked so closely together. Your father is Chris Phelps. He's an icon in the wine industry. And when I think about the relationship that the two of you have, I'm reminded of superstar athletes and their kids. So when you think of like LeBron James or like Deion Sanders and his kids, like when these people have generations after them and they come up in the sport, you look at those people like, man, they got to crush. If they're going to be doing what their parents are doing, they got to bring it. And when I look at you and the fact that you and your father work so closely together and everything that you do in the wine industry, bro, you crush it so hard, just like some of these kids that, and you're not a kid, but like the second generation that are coming in, the pressure's on, man. And you have done an exceptional job. Like your wines are incredible. Your relationships are incredible. And I just want to say, man, that it's so refreshing. I feel like you and your father hand in hand, like you're so contributable to him in the same regard that he is to you. And so I just want to say, man, that with all these things being said, dude, it's an honor to have you here today. I'm very excited for our chat and having you here today on the podcast, brother.
very flattering introduction, man. Thank you. You're very kind. And we'll see if I can follow up Petrosky.
Yeah. Dan's cool, man. He just got hooked up with Gallo. A lot of good things are happening for him. But I want to jump in, dude. I want to talk about when you were younger and you were going to school. To my knowledge, you weren't really trying to work in wine. I think you were more interested in business and entrepreneurship. What was it when you were going to school that was so inspiring for you? Did you want to own your own company? Did wine have any sort of thing to do with it? Because you do come from a family of wine. Talk me through that.
Yeah, good question. I think I went to college in Northern California at a state school, and really, I don't know, at that time in life, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. I guess from a young age, I knew I wanted to own a business or work for myself. And I didn't really like the idea of working for anybody. I wouldn't say wine was like an initial calling. I think I grew up around it and I took it for granted. And I didn't really have an appreciation for it at that time. And it took until I partway through college, I think I was about 21. And I went to France with my family, and I was the oldest of four kids, and we didn't really travel like that as a family. It was the first time I went to Europe, and we went to France, and I think I got to be a part of my dad's world there. My dad went to grad school in Bordeaux. My parents
Yeah.
lived there. And so seeing the wine business outside of Napa and getting like a taste of just what that looks like definitely triggered something as far as maybe this business is interesting and maybe there's a lifestyle around it that is interesting. And then really from that point, just really started to get interested in wine, not just Napa wine. I think I grew up around a lot of Napa wine, but then I think I really got interested in wine when I started getting into wine from other regions and learning about it as a whole and saying, maybe this is pretty cool. And so I started working in wine sales in college for a distributor while simultaneously working at a wine bar in college. And from there, it just continued to unfold. And I started a wine brand as my senior project in college and wound up bringing that to fruition as my first company while simultaneously working for a distributor for 3 or 4 years. just out of school, continuing to learn how to sell. Cause I agree with you. That is the important piece. That's
Dude.
a lot of winemakers don't understand. And for me, it was sales first. That was really like, that's always been my focus from the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's that entrepreneurial spirit. I think not wanting to work for somebody is such a great thing today to be proud of, to talk about. I think a lot of people today, especially in social media, are doing things, working for themselves, if you will. And it's interesting you were talking about having to go to France, or when you went to France, it's almost like you needed another messenger. Sometimes where somebody's trying to tell you something and you may not actually take that information until you get that information from somebody else. And all of a sudden wine was
Totally.
like, "Ooh," like you were in France and it was just a different messenger kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was like Napa Cabernet, which I still love. And is a piece of what we do. But I think it was really getting outside of that bubble and experiencing. I was lucky that we drank Napa Cab, but to be honest, like my parents are like much more French focused. So
Totally.
I was fortunate to grow up drinking Bordeaux and white Burgundy and stuff that kind of was a little more stimulating than just drinking California wine all the time. But yeah,
When you, so like when you're a second generation or when you're a next generation and you're growing up, you grew up in St. Helena, is there this kind of pressure amongst people like yourself when you're growing up to work in the wine industry? I feel like it depends really if like how many people or where your parents have worked or things like that. Like for me, it was like get out of my hometown as quick as I can. Go
oh,
somewhere else and do something big. Is that the same mentality for you, or are people like, no, we where people want to go, that's where we're at. Let's keep this going.
it's a very split thing. So always looked at it as, yes, I'm next generation, but my father was a winemaker for other people. We didn't own some fancy winery. I have a lot of close friends that did grow up owning prominent wineries in Napa Valley. I
Mhm.
think that's a whole nother pressure, right? Because then are you taking over this estate and are you going to run this? And I'd say that's like a 50-50 split. Some of those kids decided to run it and they're doing an amazing job. Some of my closest friends are doing that. And then others said, this isn't for me. I'm getting out. A lot of those people you had the financial ability to make that decision.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't have financial backing per se. I was lucky to have a dad that was in the business and had that opportunities because of
Mhm.
that. So for me, it really wasn't, I wasn't inheriting anything or I wasn't taking anything on. So it was really, I'd say in my position, it's also like a 50-50. Some kids that grew up with winemaker parent are like, yeah, this is cool. I'm going to do this. And a lot get out of town and don't come back. We live in a small place and it's expensive and it's hard to live here. And so I think, yeah, it's a split. For me, it was much more about, I like being close to family. So I do being here and it's a beautiful place, but it was definitely much more about the business opportunity and the opportunities that I saw early on that I could do something differently and create, hopefully, what has become a viable business.
Yeah, it sounded like your dad too was, if I had to imagine, this is just me guessing, but he was just very supportive of you just following what you want to do. And especially too, I feel like as somebody like yourself who's seeking out business, owning your own company, owning your own brand. We'll talk a little bit about Taken here in a little bit and of course Grounded, but it sounds like your dad was just very supportive of you just living out your dream and not putting that pressure on. I want to talk a little bit about Chamber and Chambers Wine Merchants. Was this an opportunity for you to learn the business side of wine? Were you thinking that the sales of wine was your path? What was going through your mind with this?
Yeah, so that was I can give you I worked for two distributors. So when I was in college, I got a job at a wine bar, and then I was simultaneously my dad had been consulting for some people that were represented by Chambers, which is a notable distributor in California.
Mhm.
And I worked for them in the town I went to school at. I would call, I'm sure going back and talking to their ownership, that it was like cute. It was like a college kid that was doing very minimal, that was making very minimal impact. But it was definitely an opportunity to learn how to take a product out and cold call
Mhm.
accounts. I had no idea what I was doing. Um, and I was just starting to learn about wine, but I had a great portfolio. I got to taste a lot of wines because of it. And so really I was just going around this college town selling wine to restaurants from this portfolio. I probably had like a dozen accounts, like
Mhm.
active accounts. Um, and so I did that for probably almost 2 years towards the end of college. And then I worked for Joel Gott
Yeah.
at Harvest, he's longtime friend, mentor. And I obviously ended up going down like more of an affordable wine path as well.
Yeah.
Uh, Then right after that, I went back to distribution, and that's really when I honed in sales. I worked for Kimberly Jones, which is a distributor here in California. So that's really the distributor I actually spent more time with versus Chambers. And she owns the distributor. She still does. She's amazing and had a great portfolio at the time. We were selling like things that people needed, restaurants and stores. And so I opened up this whole Central Valley, Sacramento region for her. And that's really what I was like, I spent several years knocking on doors, selling other people's wine. And I had started taking during that phase.
So I want to ask you real quick about Joel Gott, and then I'll talk a little bit about Kimberly Jones. When you were at Joel Gott, were you trying to learn, was one of the advantages that you had in your mind working in harvest was to understand a better appreciation of the production side of wine so that when you're going and selling these wines, you have a better vocabulary or you understand it much more. Even though you're from a family of wine, you've probably seen how this goes. What was the goal with that internship?
I think that I had grown up like in the cellar with my dad and understanding the process and what was happening. And I had definitely knew the wine business. And I think, I don't know, it was just like an interesting opportunity to like really hone in on the winemaking process during harvest and experience it on a greater scale than I had before with my dad, where back then Joel wasn't, his wines, he's a much bigger company than he was a decade ago. But it was still much more sizable and a lot more going on than like maybe your average Napa producer that's making a couple wines. So super interesting and great opportunity to experience something that was a little bit larger production, but still making super high quality products for what the wines, for what they are. And I think just gave me like an insight into that world. And yeah, honestly, you nailed it as far as just giving me like a true understanding of everything. And then from there, started making wine the following year.
You mentioned Kimberly Jones, and you had the privilege of working alongside her, Chris Blanchard, Master Somm.
I'm having drinks with Chris this afternoon.
That's cool, man. When you think about Kimberly Jones, for people that don't know, she's a broker and she has a lot of high-end wines in her portfolio, and you won't find a lot of these wines on the shelf. And I think one of my questions about this really is getting to learn from both of them and getting to see these wines and have an understanding of these wines. What did these wines personally tell you that I guess the broader scope of the wine industry maybe wasn't speaking? Because when you look at a wine under her portfolio, it's the Grand Slam and her name is behind that. And when you're working with something like that and learning from people like her, Chris, you're learning something special. Were you wanting to really tap into this cult kind of environment or learn what high-end wines really meant versus like the industry in general?
I really just wanted to work in sales. And I think that the opportunity came about, but I was very lucky because you're absolutely right. Kimberly has built an amazing portfolio that, really just because of her and her ability to sell and her ability to build relationships. But she had Scarecrow and the list goes on, these amazing kind of like the highest level of Cabernet Napa. And that was like her specialty. And we're lucky enough to have my dad's wine in her portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely.
But at the time it was interesting because her company has evolved as well. And over a decade ago, we were selling Orange Swifts, we had Prisoner, we had Butter. We had a whole segment of the portfolio that was like breadwinner. Like that's where we were making a lot of our money. And then we also had all these allocated wines that everyone needed. So it was a pretty sweet portfolio. I remember walking around Sacramento with flip-flops and a t-shirt, and all these guys from Southern Wine and Spirits had their suits on with their entourage. And I could get cut right in line at all these places because this guy's here. I had just so many things that they needed.
Yeah.
And there's an ocean of wine out there. And it's like, when you're creating something, you want to create something that like people feel like they need and that they want, and there's value, whether it's affordable or high end, there needs to be a perceived value. And it was really interesting. You learn a lot when you're like selling a portfolio to see what works and see what doesn't work. And fortunately, a lot of her portfolio worked. And yeah, super fun portfolio, really fun experience. It was she still runs a very intimate company. Like the Christmas parties, I'm sure, are still in her living room.
Yeah.
And at the time, there was like 30 of us, and we'd have these dinners and stuff at her house around a lot of cool winemakers. And yeah, it definitely opened a lot of doors and just opened up your mind to a broader world of wine.
Dude, you reminded me of something. So like you're walking around with these super premium wines, you're in your flip flops, and it's always you're comparing yourself to Southern, but you've got this front of the line kind of portfolio that you're bringing. And so it doesn't matter how big anybody is, you've got the premium good
Totally.
stuff. And it reminds me of when I worked in a restaurant over 10 years ago, sometimes one of the co-founders of Amazon would be in town and he'd come to the restaurant. And this guy, he always would drink Screaming Eagle, he would drink Penfolds Grange, whatever, like the best wines on the wine list. But he would come into the restaurant with a tie-dye shirt on, like this crazy burly beard, Levi's. And this is like one of the co-founders of Amazon. And he's coming in and he's drinking all these incredible wines. And so it's funny, you brought that to my attention. You brought that to my mind because sometimes, you'll see something and it's not always about the perception. It's always about the quality of either the person or the wines. And you were definitely bringing that quality. And I want to talk a little bit about your father. So I mentioned your father in the beginning of the podcast, and your father and yourself have been partnered up since 2009 and you work closely together. Talk a little bit about Chris. Talk about some things before you were born. I guess his time in Bordeaux, he was a part of Christian Moex and Petrus. He was a part of the 82 vintage, I believe. He got to work at Dominus. He was winemaking at Camus, Inglenook, consulting at Inglenook. He has his own personal brand. He even used to be a firefighter. Your dad is a super cool guy. But talk about him and some of those stories that you've either heard or been told or that he shared with you about just how cool he is.
You really done your research, man. So yeah, my dad my parents both grew up in California. My dad in Northern California, my mom in Southern California. They met at Davis, where he went to school for wine, and which I wish I went to school for wine. But he went to school to originally be a doctor and pivoted into winemaking. And his parents, my grandfather, they lived in Livermore, which is like in the East Bay, and which is a wine region. It's not Napa, but it's known for some prominent wineries. And so they were around wine and they were into collecting wine to an extent and had a wine cellar and made wine in the garage. He was exposed to wine. That was his exposure to wine. That's how he got into wine. And I think that he is smart and lucky and left after Davis, went to grad school at University of Bordeaux, met Christian Moex, as he mentioned, and he could tell the story better than me, but basically he got like a job offer to work at Petrus, and him and my mom were on holiday, like in the south of France or something, and kind of blew it off.
That's funny, dude.
And later didn't blow it off, and later ended up responding, but he was late. Then ended up working at another Moex property in 82, and then went to Napa and did an internship at Louis Martini, I think, and then ended up coming back to Petrus to do a season at Petrus. They actually my parents lived in Petrus and did that prior to coming back to Napa to found Dominus. And Christian offered him the founding winemaker job at Dominus, which is super cool. Those wines to this day, I think like 91 Dominus is probably my favorite Napa cab. And those wines he hasn't made those wines for a long time, but they're still just like some of the highest level wines out of Napa because they're still made in such a restrained, like beautiful style.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he went on after Dominus. He made the red wines at Camus for a period of time. This is like pre-Camus being Camus.
Yeah.
What it is today. And then from there went on to consult for a handful of people in Inglenook for sure, which he still is there. And then started his own project, which I helped him with.
Yeah.
That's the same time I was starting my first project. So I was a senior in college. And I told him, I shamed him into, not shamed him, but pushed him into doing it and was like, hey, I was starting a project. Why don't you start a project? Like it's about time. And that kind of just happened through a confluence of events. And I still help him operate those brands today.
Dude, I was actually going to mention that you actually helped encourage him. And one more thing I wanted to talk about your father was one of the inspirations, other than you encouraging him, was an experience that he went through in life. It was unfortunate. I was hoping you could share that story because it represents the name of the brand, the meaning behind the brand. And your father, Chris, really learned this really deep and passionate appreciation for life. In fact, the name Ad Vivum is actually Latin for to live. Your father, I think, if I could think for him or if I could imagine, he has this experience and he all of a sudden realizes that even the simplest things in life are important. Dude, even me and you having this conversation right now for the podcast, but for me, I look at it from a deeper appreciation because I really do look up to you. I think when I said in the beginning of the podcast, I am very much inspired by you. And I do really think you're a very cool guy because I can see the passion behind what you do. I can see the intent or the kind of person that you are and why you do what you do. You don't do what you do because you fell into anything. You don't do what you do because your father is who he is. You do it from a place of passion, from a place of drive. And I think that's a reflection also on your father. And one of the things that inspired him to create that brand, thanks to you for the encouragement too. But share that story and talk a little bit about the name and the meaning behind the brand as a whole.
Yeah. So he started at Vivum in 2000. I'm trying to think. The first vintage was 2007. So I think we brought it to market in 2010. That was like the founding year. And that was the same 2010, 2011 was the year I founded my first company. And so, man, 13 years ago.
That's crazy, dude.
Oh, yeah. 12, maybe 12 since I started taking, but him and my brother were on it was actually a Boy Scout trip, but it was a backpacking trip with a group of dads and a group of sons that were like the generation below, like my buddies' brothers and then our dad. So I had one of my best friends' dad and brother was there as well. And they were on this trip in the Sierras, like a mega like backpacking trip, and they got hit by lightning. There was a storm and they were like, there was a situation that like a bunch of them got hit by lightning and one kid died and one adult died. And then it was pretty traumatic. Like my dad was out and they got helicopters and the whole thing. And obviously it's super rare to get hit by lightning, but I think my dad and brother were both there. And I think it's been traumatic. It's always going to be traumatic for both of them. And it's affected them in their own ways. And it's affected kind of everyone in that group in their own ways. But I think that when he came back from that and was naming this wine, he'd already made the first vintage, I think, and named this wine. That was a factor in his thought process at that point. So Ad Vivum is where wine and life meet, but the idea is that life is precious and life is important, and wine can be used to enhance your life, especially when enjoyed with your family and friends. And so that kind of led to that story and that naming. And naming's hard, so you got to come up with something.
Yeah, I know, right? When I think about what it would be like to hang out around you or hang out around your dad, I feel like your dad is probably just a super loving, passionate dude. Sometimes we go through things in life and it's so unfortunate to know that you all have had to experience that. But sometimes there are good things that come from moments that are bad, and you can look at it in a couple of different ways. And I know that this is a wine that is a tribute to his friends and their kids and all the people that were there, but also just to life and to the meaning of life and to the love of family and friends. And so I appreciate you sharing that. I want to talk a little bit about Taken. So Taken is a brand that you co-founded. And this is kind of, I feel like this was almost like a piggyback off of some of the things you were learning with Kimberly Jones. Like you were really trying to take a step in this direction. Sales was obviously in your forefront. And this is before Grounded. So we're going to talk about Grounded in just a little bit, but talk about Taken and what inspired you to co-found that brand.
Yeah. So I created Taken as a senior project in college. And it was before I really understood like the market, but I had an idea. I saw like what was happening in Napa, and prices you could see like prices. Now it's like the average bottle of Cabernet is $100.
Mm-hmm.
Back then it was probably $60. But I think I looked at this sweet spot of like having a $30 Napa Cab and kind of being about to graduate from college. And I was like, that's an accessible price point. That's something that like I could enjoy. And I saw some activity around that price point and already happening. And so I kind of built out this plan to launch something. And then I ended up bringing in a childhood friend who helped with the capitalization of that, and I ran the company for 6 years or so. And through that time, there's a whole series of events, but essentially I was fortunate enough to a couple years in partner with Trinchero Family Estates.
Yeah.
Who is, this big company who has an amazing sales team and just an overall, like very buttoned up organization that was able to help us scale that. And so that alone was just an amazing experience of starting this thing we literally started with 100 cases in 2010. And when we parted ways, I can't remember the case count, but call it maybe 40,000, and was able to really scale that over the course of those years. And with the help of this large company, that's really when I got to like hone in on working with the distributor relationships and national account relationships, and like meeting a lot of those people and getting to know the R&DC system and so many of these kind of pieces of the puzzle that have helped me to be able to start my own company after that. So forever grateful to that organization and the family for that opportunity. And then I parted ways and sold my equity in 2017 in order to get started on building out Grounded Wine Company, because I felt like I really wanted to do something on my own. I had decided that was in my 20s, and then it's okay, let's step this up and build out something that's completely mine.
So I feel like when you're building Taken, you're almost wanting to take these high-end Kimberly Jones style wines, or this portfolio of high-end cult type wines, and you're almost wanting to make them in an affordable manner. I know affordable wines is huge for you. I wouldn't say you were trying to break the market, but were you trying to do something that was going to give the same quality for a lesser value? And that was the emphasis behind Taken?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to say that we were making Scarecrow, but we were trying to make something that was super high quality that could be shared with a lot more people. And we started with that kind of, we were buying grapes under NDA and making wine that maybe should have been a $60 wine or should have been a $70, but we were able to make it into a $30 wine. And so a lot of it was that mentality of, trying to produce something that was like punched above its weight class, that was like a gateway into that world for younger people or for anyone. Not the majority of people don't spend $200, $300, $500 on a bottle of wine.
Yeah.
And I think I saw that. I think you get jaded like in the bubble here. Not that I spend that kind of money on wine, but people, it becomes like a normal to taste and drink those wines because they're just around. But if think about it as like you're graduating from college and you're like, people are like, what? That doesn't make sense. And so a lot of it had to do with that. Literally just got personal, like to having friends that wanted to get into wine, but what's that gateway? And so I envisioned Taken being that gateway. And I haven't had that wine I haven't tried that wine, but it still exists. I haven't had it for time. But back when I was making it, it really was super high quality Cabernet from like notable places in Napa Valley that we would source from. And they were great wines.
Yeah, dude, when you reminded me when I worked Harvest in 2017, I was spoiled, dude. And I think that it's not like it's a bubble, but the best way I can describe it is it's almost like this bubble, like Napa, everybody's having these amazing wines, experiencing these amazing wines. Dude, there was days where we were just pouring vintage, like 90s vintage Chardonnays, 90s or 80s vintage Cabernets for lunch with burritos. What is it, La Luna? I think.
Yeah, La Luna.
Dude, by the way,
that's my favorite, dude.
Bro, that place hits so hard, dude. I love that place.
I still that's one of my moves when I bring the distributors and the accounts around. We go to La Luna for lunch. I bring champagne and Burgundy to La Luna. Tables in the back.
Dude, that place hits so hard. And I remember having La Lunas, which is amazing, and like a 1999 vintage Chardonnay. And it's just normal. Like we're drinking reds. It's just like one day we had this, what was it, Spring Mountain La Jolla. And it's just like normal day. And to your point, not everybody is doing that. Since then, I haven't had those everyday epic kind of experiences. And that was a big perk to work in Napa, was just being surrounded with this lush environment of drinking all these really incredible wines. And to your point of what you were saying with Taken, you were trying to spread that love, if you will, and put those types of wines in front of people, but not for those $200-$300 price points, but still giving them that quality. And I want to talk a little bit about Grounded. So you create your own brand, Grounded, in 2017. And I started to learn about your brand right away. I remember I wanted to have you on the podcast years ago, and your brand really stuck out to me. And so one of the things I love about Grounded is you take a lot of different fruit from a lot of different places to really create these nice blends. Your wines are incredibly affordable. And that's one of the things you love to focus on. And it's also one of those things too, when I think about you and your father, I feel like you do what you do so well. Your father does what he does so well, but they're totally different. Your father's making these super high-end kind of premium wines, And you're doing the same, but you're doing it in a different manner. And yet even though it's so different, it's so good the way that you guys mesh. So talk a little bit about Grounded. I want to get into some of the wines, but what inspired you to create this brand, especially considering your commitment to winemaking?
Yeah, I think as I was making take and prices started going up. And so we saw Napa getting to a point where like we took price increases and it got to a point where I'm like, this is not sustainable. I think that this is going to end up being a $60 wine, a $70 wine. And I wanted to get back to making wines that were more affordable and like kind of uber affordable. And so when I started to take Grounded, it's interesting. Like, the goal is to make the Grounded Cab and Sauvignon Blanc that we focus on today, as well as we're adding Pinot to that. And those wines are like under $20. And so that was like the goal of where we wanted to be. And those were the wines we wanted to scale. And those are the hardest wines to make because they're coming from a lot of vineyard sources. And I'm lucky, like my dad and I do all those together. And it's challenging because you're like really trying to make the best Sauvignon Blanc, the best Cabernet, the best Pinot Noir from a lot of vineyards all over the state. So when I started, we actually started with some of the smaller SKUs, and that wasn't really by design, but I had this Cabernet source in Napa. So I started Steady State, which is our Napa Cab. And then we did some wine in Washington and Oregon. And those two are funny because people say like, why did you make wines all over the West Coast? And that was truly not by design. So my last harvest, my dad had a consulting client, he still does, in Washington. And I was like intrigued with Washington because of pricing, and it was interesting, and I like the wines. And that brand is still relatively small. It has been a harder one for us to grow, to be honest. But Oregon, I was in my last harvest when I owned Taken still, I don't know, I was bored with it. And I felt like I was losing control. And I ended up just leaving town for a couple of weeks and going up to Oregon because my buddy, Nick Keeler, they had a family property called Keeler Estate, which recently sold to Antica Terra, but he has a brand called Authentique that is worth seeking out. Really awesome Oregon Pinot brand. And Nicholas lived in St. Helena at one point, sells barrels, it's a long story, but became a very close friend. And so I just went up there to see what he does and help him out with harvest. And of course, I end up buying grapes. And so I'm up there and like his family has this amazing, like organically farmed estate, like beautiful Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And I bought some grapes from them while I was there and wound up making some Pinot at that winery.
Oh yeah.
And it was cool because Nick makes like totally different style of wine than me and influenced how I was making that wine. And so it just ended up evolving. So next thing we had this Napa Cab, we had this Oregon Pinot. We're making rosé on the Central Coast. And so we had all these wines in the works. And then I started really piecing them together from a sales and marketing angle and figuring out how we were going to approach this from like a company standpoint and how we were going to make these brands play together. And we just did that over 2 years. I brought wines to market really in 19, our first 3 wines to market in 19. And then 20 hit, we introduced our core wines in 20.
Yeah.
Which are now the bigger SKUs, but that was 3 years ago, not that long ago, but it seems like a long time ago. And that was a nightmare because we made these wines and then the world shut down. And we were super lucky with some relationships I had, and my friends at Target agreed to bring them to life and nationally for us. And so that was a huge relief and really helped us get those wines off the ground. So that was, 19. So 4 years ago, we brought 6,000 cases to market. Now we're about 50,000 cases all in.
Yeah. Your distribution is huge. I know you can get your wines just about anywhere, and your case production, if you will, is also very huge. I was wondering, when you were making that Washington and that Oregon wine, was there any idea of you bringing the fruit down to California, or have you always made it up there?
We've always made it up there. And I think because we had relationships up there at wineries, I've never even toyed with bringing it down here.
Yeah.
We make and bottle everything in their regions. So we have a small amount of wine we make in Washington, and that wine is sold in like certain regions. The Oregon brand is a national brand now. So we sell that everywhere. And then the wines on the Central Coast in Santa Barbara and Paso and Central Valley, that's all produced and bottled there. And then everything comes to Napa County as finished goods. Mm-hmm. So we can the same warehouse and make it easier for our distributor partners.
So I want to talk about three of your wines real quick. I'm glad you mentioned the Washington and the Oregon Pinot, but you have Public Radio, Collusion, and you have your Space Age Rosé. Talk a little bit about Public Radio and the reference to the letters on the label, which is pretty cool. There's a story to that. Collusion also has a story too, as far as the early days of Prohibition. And then Space Age is a Monterey 100% Grenache Rosé. And I think you also distribute that in cans, which is cool because I like the idea of cans. The bottle is a pretty bottle, but the cans give you this outdoor picnic kind of vibe. Like it's a different way to enjoy the wine, not necessarily from the bottle. So I love the marketing behind that. But talk about those three wines and just the inspiration behind them.
Yeah, those are three interesting wines to talk about. So Public Radio and Collusion are our little wine. They're like our smallest production wines. And then Space Age is bigger. The cans are like an R&D project.
Yeah.
So we'll start with Collusion. We were talking about the Washington stuff, and my dad consults for Banffy up there and makes a collaborative project with them. It's a pretty fun little project. And I just thought that like growing up here, the Cabernet up there is just, it's a little bit fresh. Like that's a general statement, but there's an ability to make like fresh red fruit driven, right, different Cabernet in a way that still has all those Cabernet qualities that everyone loves. And to do it at a price, we're making a $20 cab up there. That's like a very high level wine. And so we started making that, and Washington wine still hasn't like fully caught its stride. It has. You look at people like Charles Smith, who've done an amazing job.
Totally.
But it still hasn't fully caught its stride in a lot of markets. And it's been a smaller brand for us, which is fun. It's something that we can work on that's not like huge. We focus on certain markets with this wine. We really focus on the state of Washington, and we do pretty well with it in New York and certain pockets of the country, but it's just a few thousand case production. And that wine, Collusion, is nods to that pre-prohibition era, colluding to do something illegal. And we had a lot of fun with all of our naming and tying it all there. And I worked with some friends on that in Mexico City. Actually, we spent a lot of nights and a lot of mezcal working on that, but that's Collusion, and it has its niche in our portfolio. And then Public Radio, which I love, is a Grenache blend with a little Syrah. Literally a couple thousand cases. We're sold out right now we're sold out for the next 6 months, but that we release seasonally, and it is in and it's out. And so also not a core item, but a fun item that we get to work with some really cool vineyards in West Paso Robles and try to make something that Paso can produce some really like big, intense wines. And we're trying to do something there that's a little prettier, that reminds you of a Southern Rhone. Actually, fascinating wine to watch age. I just tasted the 17 the other day, which is the 18, the first vintage we made. And it's just super delicious. And it's got some really nice, characteristics from the little bit of age it has. And that one, my dad's dad, who got our family into wine, was an amateur radio guy, to say the least. And his call sign is on the front of that label on the Public Radio. So that's a fun brand. And then Space Age is our rosé brand. That's Santa Barbara County, Central Coast, Grenache. Blend varies, but generally it's Grenache. Last years it's been Grenache with a 5 to 10% of since, and really making classic Provence style rosé. So it's like whole cluster press, very limited skin contact. Really, like we just keep it on the skins through the press cycle, and then there's no more skin contact. So that's 4 hours. So it's beautiful light. It's taken us like 4 vintages to hone in on exactly what we want that to be. Going back to the first vintage is like maybe questionable. I don't really love dark, like that kind of like bigger rosé.
Yeah.
But I think we've really got to a nice stride with that wine. And we make it in a canned format. We did that. We canned those last summer, and we've done a few runs. It's a spritz. So it's rosé. We leave a little bit of RS on that rosé that we specifically make for that.
Yeah.
And then we water and natural flavoring. And so it's not sweet, but it has a little bit of sweetness, natural sweetness. And it's super good. I think they're delicious. It's been a tricky category. We'll see. We've got some really nice hits on it right now. And we're not like focusing on it as a company because we're small and we have bigger brands, but it's been really fun. And we're just seeing how it unfolds. So some of our retail partners have really given us some love there, and you can find it in some Whole Foods and Target and some places around the country.
Dude, I was thinking about, so I was talking with our management at my restaurant in South Florida, and I'm like, this we want to get the rosé on our wine list. And I'm like, but the cans would be cool for brunch.
You even have a little bucket of them.
Yeah.
Because it's cute packaging and it plays. I think it's the quality is really good. Like I drink, I'm like, man, I forget how good these are. It's just been a tricky category. Like wine-based spritz, wine-based seltzer is not like the easiest category because wine is more expensive than malt liquor and so all these alternatives tend to be a little better priced. But the wine one, like most of them don't taste good.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky one, but we'll just see how it evolves and have a little fun with it and keep it as part of the family of brand.
I got some cans, dude. Even if you stop selling them.
Yeah,
I like, what's that?
I can get you some cans.
Dude, I'm not trying to compare it to, you remember back in the days when Sophia was putting cans out, about sparkling cans. And from a marketing standpoint, dude, I think you're just not worried about the risk and you're looking at the idea of kind of marketing in a different way. We were talking about Dan Petrosky earlier, and Dan's made marketing from a metaverse standpoint and NFT standpoint. And I think that's really cool. And so I think anytime you purchase wines from Dan in the future, or even maybe now, you get access to an NFT, which is cool. And nobody's thinking about that kind of stuff in the wine industry. So I like how you're just expanding or broadening your thoughts on like, how can we do this different, but at the same time, give people something that represents us.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. I think it's about finding interesting ways to make it interesting, make it just different. And not everything has to click. I think that we're constantly like honing in on what we're doing and making changes, and we're not afraid to cut a brand. We're not afraid to add brands, and we're just constantly evolving.
Yeah, dude, you also got some swag too. I saw some posts. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I just thought about this. Salmon Blanc was a shirt.
Yeah.
And you got some, dude, talk about your swag. I'm going to link it in the show notes.
We've always created like cool swag, like over the last 4 years. I have like lots of shirts and hats, and it's more just like classically branded, but it's like good branding and quality stuff. And we've never sold it. We just give it out. I'll send you some. It's nice stuff. But yeah, those guys, all the time. I was literally in Aspen for Food and Wine.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite events. And I'm sitting at a dive bar with my buddy, Sam Smith, who's from here in Napa, another winemaker. And we're sitting there. We meet these young dudes that are like a decade younger than us, that somehow we start chatting with them, and they have this clothing brand. Like they're making these like cool shirts, and it's goofy. It's called Roll Face.
Mm-hmm.
And long story short, like we became friends, and they're really great guys. And they worked for me last year at Aspen Food and Wine. And then recently I got them to come out to Napa and took care of them for a weekend here. And we worked on that collaboration. And it's honestly, their whole theme is like this sushi theme. You have to go on their website and see it.
Yeah.
It's fun, and it's just like fun to have those collaborations. So we did a Grounded Wine Company Roll Face collaboration that really, it's all them. They did the design and they did the execution, but fun to be a part of. And yeah, it's fun. They're cool shirts. I've been wearing them. They're fun.
Bro, I was actually checking out their website, but I noticed like you guys were rolling up sushi, and I think there was a picture of you drinking some wine from the bottle. Like you guys were living your best life, dude. And I think that's cool. That's one of the great things about the wine industry, not to dumb that down, because that's what it is, dude. It's like having fun, doing things different, collab. We're talking about your spritzer and all that. But dude, at the end of the day, you are here to do something as a business. But dude, the fun and the community and the engagements and the cross promotions and all that, I think that's one of the even better parts of the wine industry. Going back to sales is probably more important than making the wine, because you can make the wine, but you got to get the stuff out there into the consumer's hands. And so I love the relationships, dude. I wanted to ask you one more question. So I wanted to talk with you about your Bronco. So your Bronco seems to be a pretty cool topic. Some of the things that I've seen or people talk about. What's so special about this Bronco of yours, dude?
Oh man, I don't know. I'm starting to think that there's nothing special about that Bronco. It's funny you ask. When I sold Taken, I was on my way to Aspen Food and Wine, and I was with like the guys from Food and Wine magazine, Ray Isle, and I think Anthony Giglio, and we had gone to Frasca in Boulder the night before for dinner. It was a tradition for a couple of years before we went to the festival, and we went to Frasca, and then we drove back through Denver, and I had to pick somebody up at the airport. I had to pick Terry Wheatley up at the airport, who was the close friend and advisor, but at the time was the president of Vintage Wine Estates, who I was affiliated with for a moment in time. And we were waiting, and I knew about this like show, this vintage car place that I wanted to go to. And so I was like, guys, do you mind if we make a pit stop and stop by this dealership or this showroom? And that car was in front, and that was the car I wanted as a kid. And it was in front, and it hadn't even been like cleaned yet. It had just been dropped off. Like it was going to be cleaned up and maybe fixed up a little bit and put for sale.
Yeah.
And it was there, and I walked around the whole place, and I saw that one. I'm like, man, that's the car. So I start talking to these guys, and like they start bringing you like a little whiskey, like they start getting you eased up. And I was like, I'm not going to buy it. It's a nice idea. Between Denver and Aspen, somehow, like they called me, they said someone else was looking at it. It was that whole sales tactic.
Yeah.
And everyone in the car with me was like giving me shit, like just get it. So long story short, I purchased it in the car and had it delivered to Napa. And since then it's been, let's just call it a labor of love. That's probably the way of putting it. It's always got a problem, but it's fun. Fun to drive.
It's a nice Bronco, dude. Like it's very nice. It looks good in picture, but I'm sure it looks great in person.
It's cool. It's still like vintage, and it's still like original. So this isn't like some completely tricked out fancy Bronco. It's pretty it's pretty basic in that sense, but it's super nice. And it's fun to drive when it starts.
Yeah. Well, people can definitely see you coming from a mile away, dude.
You can hear it from a mile.
Josh, where can people find you? How can they learn more about you on social media, through your websites? I'm going to link all this in the show notes, by the way, but share a little bit about that.
Yeah, we're nationally available at groundedwineco.com, at our Instagram, Grounded Wine Co, Josh Phelps. We're also available like throughout the country. So I encourage you we work with a lot of different retailers like Target and Whole Foods and Safeway Albertsons, as well as independent retail and restaurant in all markets in all 50 states. We're nationally aligned with our partners, RNDC. So a big thank you to our friends at RNDC. And then as well as some amazing independent family-owned distributors like Skurnik on the East Coast. And so super lucky to have a really great distribution network that has our wines all over the country. But if you can't find them, you can definitely get them from us. And we have pretty fair shipping rates.
Yeah, that's cool, man. Like I said, that'll be in the show notes. I have one more question here before we jump off. When you think about people that are wanting to get in the wine industry, of course, I know you want to encourage people to follow whatever they want to do, whether it's winemaking, working in tasting rooms, things like that. But you're a business guy, you're an entrepreneur, and you're a guy that likes to create opportunity. You're a guy that also is not afraid of risk. So what advice would you give somebody that's listening today that maybe they don't necessarily want to actually work in production, but they want to do things where they can have an advantage as far as the business side of winemaking is concerned? What kind of steps would you encourage that person to take?
I think for me, I think sales was a really key. It depends like where you're at in life. I think if you can go to school for it, I think there's a benefit. Like I wish that I had gone to school like to learn about wine, but I think sales in any field is kind of the best experience, right? Yeah. I think that you're selling wine or you're selling any commodity. And with selling wine in particular, it's scrappy and it's not really easy and it's not that rewarding. It can be rewarding, but it's hard. It can be a great career. I know people that have made a great career out of wine sales with distributors. It can create a lot of opportunity, but it's not easy. No one's going to tell you it's easy, but you learn a lot. You learn about wine, you learn how to sell. And I think that's like the key. That's something that like everyone should do. It's like working in a restaurant, right? Everyone should work in a restaurant at some point in life.
Yeah.
And I think if you're going to work in the field, you should work in sales, whether you turn that into a career or whether you use that as a piece of your kind of path. But for me, that was the most beneficial thing that I did. But that was like the only job I ever did. But that was the most beneficial thing I did. Yeah.
Sometimes people will say sales is not for me. And I heard somebody say once that anybody that tries to convince you how sales is not for them, they're actually selling you on the fact that they don't want to be in sales, which means that they're actually good at sales. They just don't want to give themselves the credit. And it's like when I cold call, I call people or I'll email and I'll reach out to people, and cold calling is sales as well. Like I want to have people on the podcast like yourself, and I've wanted you on the podcast for several years, but sometimes things don't happen as soon as you want. Sometimes things are a slow burn. but you have to stay focused. You have to stay committed. And I wanted to piggyback off your answer because I think that you're right, man. I think sales is huge. Cold calling, being patient, not always assuming that you can't necessarily sell something, because when you think that you can't, you're actually selling on the fact that you can't. And so I think that was a great answer, dude. And at the end of the day, sales is one of the big things that can get you through this life, especially in this market, whether you're working for yourself or working for somebody else. And Josh, I wanted to thank you, man. Like having you on the podcast today, it's truly an honor getting to hear a little bit about your personal story, you sharing about your father and the things he went through and everything that he's done to make a big impact. But bro, everything that you have done to make an impact in the wine industry, I am truly honored, man. You're the kind of guy that is a representation of our generation. 20 years, 30 years from now, people that are our age or younger are going to be talking about guys like you, man, guys like you who paved the way for this generation. And I look up to you a lot. I look up to the fact that you do what you do and you're so good at it with sales and your wines. And you're trying to give somebody a more affordable approach to really good quality wines where they don't have to break the bank. And dude, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to share with me a little bit of that time today, man. I really appreciate you a lot, brother.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate you having me. Look forward to hanging in person soon, I hope.
Hell yeah, dude.